My last explicitly political video was titled "Everything Normal is Right-Wing," and it was a short discussion of how the extreme left has sectioned off essential parts of the common human experience and declared them to be right-wing. In doing so, these radicals have basically assured that the average person will reject them every single time. This video is a direct continuation of that one, so I recommend you go back and watch it first if you haven't already. But here's a quick TLDR anyway. To the radicals, anything normal is right-wing, because the normal upholds the status quo of liberal democratic capitalism, and they seek to overthrow that status quo. Therefore, every way in which you act normal, even if you think you're being neutral or apolitical, well, your personal behavior only reinforces the system that they want to topple. That's why, in their eyes, getting fit turns you into a right-wing jerk. You are literally Hitler if you want a family, a wife, and kids. If you enjoy old British TV shows, you're fostering far-right sympathies. If you like Lord of the Rings or 1984, you're a right-wing extremist. If you want entrance exams for upper-tier schools and specialized classes for gifted kids, you've got a far-right agenda. If there's a Viking statue in town, it's a monument to far-right slavery. If you love your country, you're an incel. The list goes on. Basically, progress is marching ever forward, and if you think things actually were better before, even if what you believed before was positively leftist 10 or 20 years ago, you're now far-right, alt-right, fascist. You're an incel. You're toxic whiteness, toxic masculinity, whatever. Well, all of this nonsense is starting to translate into electoral victories for various right-wing parties across the world, and progressives are starting to sweat bullets. I'll probably do more in-depth dives into some of these countries at some point, but for today, let's just take a scattershot look at what's been happening. The right-wing wave seemed to begin, in terms of elections won, with the 2022 Italian election, where Giorgia Meloni became Prime Minister of Italy. Meloni's got a long history of political involvement. When she was 15 in 1992, she joined the youth wing of the MSI, Italy's then post-fascist political party. The party moderated and merged with other right-wing parties several times to form the PDL, and in 2012 the more solidly right-wing faction of the PDL split off again to create the Brothers of Italy, which Meloni currently leads. The Brothers of Italy is self-described as conservative nationalist, while its detractors call it fascist. Meloni is religious, opposed to medical euthanasia, same-sex marriage, and gay and trans parents. She supports military action to stop illegal immigration. She supports NATO, but is skeptical of the European Union. And she supported Russia until the invasion of Ukraine, where she switched to supporting Ukraine. Regardless of what you think of these positions, Meloni and the Brothers of Italy have continued to enjoy popular support among Italian voters. And generally, when you hear of her in Western media, it's usually retarded headlines like this, where lefty journalists claim that an immigrant gang problem is empowering Italy's far right, as if the far right is the problem and not the gang rapes. But I think the big high-profile win was the 2023 Argentine presidential election. President Milei is the first president in, I think, any country who explicitly identifies as a minarchist. A minarchy is a theoretical libertarian state, which only exists to enforce the non-aggression principle. Minarchists are philosophically aligned with anarcho-capitalists, but believe that a fully anarchist society would not have the necessary protections to enforce the NAP. A minarchist government, therefore, only consists of the military, the police, and the courts. This type of state has been mocked by both socialists and fascists as the night watchman state, meaning a state that only exists to prevent theft and do nothing else, using the German word Nachtwächter, which in German has a double meaning, also referring to somebody who is incompetent and stupid. The socialists and fascists use the term night watchman state to mock the liberals, because the classical liberals of the early 1900s were a lot closer to minarchists than the modern social liberals of today. The point is, nobody holding this specific philosophy has ever been elected to a major office in any even semi-relevant country until Argentina. Despite how negatively he's been reported on in the Western media, he's well regarded by the Argentine people. He's sticking to his guns regarding shrinking the scope and power of the government. And frankly, he seems to be somewhat of an eccentric memester on the internet.
Al zurdo de mierda no le podés dar ni un milímetro.
Pero ¿me podés definir zurdo de mierda que no
Todos
lo
los que,
entiendo?
digamos, los colectivistas, los que ponen, digamos, o sea, esa idea... A ver,
¿Por qué le pones de mierda, digamos?
Porque son una mierda. O sea,
vos mezclás...
no,
pero
es que si pensás, pero si pensás distinto te van a aniquilar. Ese es el punto. Es decir, vos al zurdo no le podés dar un milímetro, porque le das un milímetro y lo toma para destrozarte. Es decir, digamos, o sea, vos no podés negociar con el zurdo. No se negocia. No se negocia con esa mierda, no se negocia porque te van a llevar puesto.
Also, he reversed the government ban on Dragon Ball Z, which is always good. But there's a ton of other smaller examples of this happening all over the place. In Sweden, they went the hardest on inviting immigrants in during the EU migration crisis of the mid-2010s, and as a result, have suffered a truly staggering increase in terrorist attacks, gang violence, human trafficking, and Sharia no-go zones set up in ethnic enclaves in Swedish cities. As a result, the formerly fringe, far-right populist SD party has become the official opposition, dethroning the conservative moderate party. In the Netherlands, the 2023 general election saw the right-wing populist party, the Party for Freedom, become the largest party for the first time, siphoning voters and seats from all four mainstream parties in what Western media reported as a stunning upset. In Finland, there's a new right-wing president. In France, there's an election in the next few weeks, and a young, fiery right-wing populist is poised to become the next prime minister. In Germany, the AfD, considered to be a right-wing extremist party, and not without reason, is nonetheless growing more and more popular every year. In the UK, the Conservatives, who have ruled the country for over a decade now, despite not really doing anything conservative, are poised for a major loss, with the new Reform Party from the right chewing into their holdings. In Ireland, the far right grows more and more popular, though their elections are still a year away. In Portugal, there's right-wing electoral wins. In Australia, there's been no elections showing a right-wing rise just yet, though journalists are publishing articles about the terrifying rise of the far right, so we still might see it. The articles tend to come before the votes. In Canada, my home country, Trudeau has become one of our most unpopular prime ministers ever, while the new conservative leader is a fiery right-wing populist. A snap election called in a downtown Toronto riding, which had been a Liberal safe seat since 1993, unexpectedly went conservative, foretelling what awaits Trudeau in 2025. America is frankly the outlier right now. Who wins between Biden and Trump is, at this point, a toss-up, as both candidates have serious flaws. Unlike the other examples I've listed, the polling doesn't show a guaranteed right-wing victory coming up. It might happen, but it also might not. It's not clear-cut. So why is all this happening? Why is the so-called far right, which is a label that certainly applies to some of these parties and candidates, but not all of them, why are they currently ascendant? Why is the tenuous alliance between neoliberal, progressive, and socialist forces currently failing all across the developed world? Well, I personally think it's because culturally they pushed way too far left. Going back to that everything normal is right-wing bit from before, that stuff has real electoral consequences, especially in a globalized world where culture is shared across the internet. To your average voter, normal center-left policies, like tax-funded healthcare, is something they can stomach. It's quite popular, in fact. But stuff like abolish the nuclear family, make everything and everyone queer, accept unlimited numbers of immigrants into your country, destroying everything in the process, that is not stuff that your average voter will stomach. And the leftoids who call them racist or sexist or whatever else, in order to shame them into compliance, that never ever works. The normies will always vote the left out in the 11th hour because they are destroying the things that the normies want to preserve. And the conservatives are more than happy to sell them the promise of conservation, whether or not they actually implement it. Now, of course, the online socialists are screaming that it's all capitalism's fault because they're retards who filter everything down through one lens. It's always capitalism's fault to them, even when it's clearly obviously not. But this isn't how most average people see it. I'm reminded of this testimonial from a teacher who was a progressive and is no longer, after teaching in a progressive administration. Those progressive values led the administration to positions where they couldn't discipline kids for bad behavior because the behavior was a result of trauma and therefore it's not the kid's fault. They couldn't have any standards for schoolwork in the name of equity, leading to a decline in the quality of education. And the administration was deathly afraid of being called racist to the point of total institutional paralysis. The tolerant and open nature of this specific school has basically destroyed it. And personally, I would be surprised if this were a one-off situation. A lot of people are individually reporting this sort of thing unfolding in some way around them. Maybe not exactly like this, but in their schools and in their workplaces and in their churches and clubs and unions, it's happening enough that everyone is starting to notice a pattern, and they're subsequently moving away from left-wing politics. Gen Z is actually leading the way on this, as I and many others predicted a few years ago. While they're more open towards gay and trans people in a classically liberal live and let live manner, they're less accepting of non-integrative immigrants, and they're also less accepting of the there's a million genders trans activist bullshit. And what's the left doing in response? They're screaming bloody murder about how bigoted everyone's becoming, how scary the world looks now that voters are rejecting their plans en masse, how they need to get violent in the streets in defense of their political projects, how it's only propaganda causing people to think like this, not real desires on behalf of real voters, how the next step is to attack people who have voted against them. Nowhere have I seen a coherent plan to actually address any of the issues that voters currently have. The one exception to this are the Democrats in America, who have tried and failed to get some border legislation through, since the Republicans axed it for political purposes. Put simply, they want to win the 2024 presidential election. But outside of that, every other leftist or liberal party in the developed world has decided to bury their heads in the sand and stay the course, even as it destroys them. The truth of the matter is, voters do not like the way things are currently heading, with regards to economics, globalization, immigration, censorship, and identity politics. And if all the left has is moralizing about how evil your average person is, to be concerned about these things, the left will lose everything. If these left-leaning parties want to survive, like it or not, they will have to de-radicalize away from the nonsense they've been pushing for the last couple of decades. If not, they will pay the price for it.
Could you give me a definition of what you consider is the far right?
In terms of a definition of the far right, I mean, it's obviously a political ideology, or it's a particular view that a person has. I'm not sure there is a definition. It's not.
So it's a little bit like hate.
Well,
yeah. So
it's not,
can we get? So I think we need to define
Senator,
what it is.
you have a limited amount of time. If you interrupt the minister,
Okay.
you're going to run out of time. So just let her answer the question.
Thank you.
I think what we see from a lot of people who would claim to be far right, which is not a crime for somebody to have a particular ideology, it's where they act on maybe certain matters, but we have seen people to be anti-government, anti-state, anti-immigration, anti-women's rights, amongst other things. That would be my own particular view of those who would claim to be far right.